Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. My name is Russ Ganim, and I am Associate Provost and Dean of International Programs at the University of Iowa. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's roundtable entitled Authoritarian Tendencies Across the Globe. This discussion involves 6 distinguished scholars from Europe and the Americas, whom we will introduce momentarily, and is aimed as a follow-up to Professor Timothy Snyder's presentation organized by the University of Iowa last week. Professor Snyder's talk, History and Freedom, the Past, Present, and Future of Tyranny, dealt with mounting threats to democracy in the contemporary era. Today's panelists will extend and deepen the conversation around these issues as they relate to the past, present, and future of some of the world's most recognizable political institutions. International Programs is proud to host events such as these because they promote free and open discourse on issues of global importance. Before we proceed to panelist introductions, please let me thank our communications and constituent relations staff, especially Joan Kerr, Saralta Peterson, Ben Partridge, Amy Green, and Amy Brewster for their help in organizing and publicizing this webinar. Special thanks also go to Professor Rosemarie Scullion of the French and Italian Department for her diligent efforts in bringing Professor Snyder to our campus. Please let me also thank you, our audience, for attending today's discussion. We note that Professor Snyder's original lecture is posted on International Programs' Facebook page and will be posted on the International Programs YouTube channel before the end of this month. Today's roundtable will also be posted on the International Programs YouTube channel. Please note that for today's discussion, the public may submit questions via the Q&A function. We will reserve 20 to 30 minutes at the end of the webinar for commentary from the audience. And now, please let me introduce our colleague, Marina Zaloznaya, Associate Professor of Sociology and Criminology, as well as Political Science at the University of Iowa. Marina is one of the original organizers of this roundtable, and she will introduce our panelists. Marina, thank you for all your efforts and for the introductions you are about to give.
Thank you, Russ. Welcome, everybody. I am honored to introduce a slate of really amazing, accomplished researchers who are joining us today to discuss Professor Snyder's lecture. So from around the globe, I'm going to start with Dr. Agnieszka Kubal. Dr. Agnieszka Kubal is a lecturer, assistant professor in sociology at the University College in London. And she is a human rights scholar, and her current research explores the gendered experiences of pursuing human rights in Poland. Next, we have Dr. Marco Garrido, who is a political and historical sociologist who holds the position of an associate professor at the University of Chicago. And he works on sources of democratic disenchantment and relationship with democracy in the Philippines and elsewhere. Next, we have Manuel Ballan. Dr. Manuel Ballan is an associate professor of political science and international development at McGill University in Canada. Dr. Ballan works on corruption, transparency, political competition, media, scandals, and the rule of law. From our own campus, we are welcoming Dr. Rosemarie Scullion. She's an associate professor of French and Italian here at Iowa, and she works on the history and memory of the 1930s and the Nazi occupation of France. We also are honored to welcome Dr. Carolyn Tolbert, who is a professor of political science here at Iowa and also a Lowell Battershall University Distinguished Chair. Dr. Tolbert's work is on voting, public opinion, and representation, widely defined. Finally, last but not least, please help me welcome Dr. William Reisinger. He is a professor of political science here at Iowa, and Dr. Reisinger works on public sector corruption and popular support for non-democratic governance in Eastern Europe, specifically Russia, China, Georgia, and Ukraine most recently. So thank you very much for being here, and I am very excited about the upcoming discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Marina. And one thing that I might add is that along with you, Professor Reisinger and Professor Scullion are among the co-organizers. of this panel, and we're deeply indebted to you for all of your work in putting together this event. So before we move to the panelist discussion, Professor Scullion and I thought it would be a good idea to give a brief summary, a brief recap of Professor Snyder's lecture from last week. So I'm just going to go over some major themes that at least stood out for me, and then I'll turn things over to Rosemary so that she can give her perspective on Professor Snyder's talk. So Professor Snyder began with, I think, a very simple question, but one which will elicit responses really from across the spectrum. And he simply asked, what does freedom need? And what does it require to survive and flourish? And at least, with respect to a partial answer to that question, he said it needs a future. And where freedom is threatened, at least in part, is because authoritarianism dismisses the idea of a future. And then sort of continuing with that chronological framework, Dr. Snyder also indicated that freedom needs an accurate past so that society can understand its current circumstance. He talked a lot about, misinformation that dilutes and obfuscates the past, but that this sort of temporal grounding is absolutely essential for freedom to flourish. Because freedom is, in his words, not bestowed by some external force. It needs to be pursued by society while expressing certain values. And that these values have been kind of lost, at least in recent years, because the problems facing governments have not been considered on a moral level. Rather, they've been examined on a technical level. And this is especially true after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that science, economics, and technology can simply solve all of our problems without really taking into consideration the moral dimension of what this new world order, to quote George H.W. Bush, looked like. So, with this historical context and with this emphasis on values and moral approaches to problems, comes another threat from authoritarianism, and that is that facts don't matter. And Dr. Snyder gave the example of the denial of global warming as the best example of, denying facts and repressing history and suppressing it altogether leads to quite dire circumstances. Similarly, intellect has been replaced by identity, and that identity politics has become, in many instances, the norm when approaching social and political conflict. So rather than trying to solve problems, people in government simply assert their identities and believe that can lead to a sensible resolution. So Dr. Snyder, in his concluding remarks, tried to be forward-looking, tried to at least give us a silver lining, as it were. And so his final argument really dealt with solutions that need to be pursued on an educational level, with the philosophy that we as a global society can improve our condition. And he ended his talk with, and it actually was during the discussion section, with the notion that we have lost sight that we can actually make things better. And that's one of the sad tragedies of the current circumstance in which we find ourselves, that if there's no hope, no future, no prospect of getting better, then we kind of descend into an almost nihilistic abyss. And that's what we need to avoid at all costs, because that means that the authoritarians win in that case. And so I will just sort of stop there and ask Rosemary to add to this synopsis of Professor Snyder's lecture.
Let's see, excuse me here. Thank you, Russ. I think you did a really great job summarizing it, and I'll just fill in some blanks here. Professor Snyder is advancing this notion that freedom is about tomorrow and about defending the values that help us determine what's worth acting on to defend in order to be able to project us into the future. But he's also making the very important point, and here speaking from the humanities, is that to have a future, you have to have a past. So speaking as an historian, I would say that the history profession and the history discipline has a long and rich history, particularly in Europe and in France, of problematizing its methodologies. And I'm speaking here about the kinds of temporalities that were introduced by the famed annales historians in the 1920s, including Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre, and then successive generations such as Fernand Braudel and the subsequent generations of annales historians who really introduced an interdisciplinary mode of attempting to understand history. So for the annales historians, they had this notion of the longue durée, the long duration of history where there are sort of sedimented structures that don't change across time. And they said that's not the only temporality of history that we need to understand, but that and especially at that time, history was written as what they called the histoire événementielle, event history. Basically, the great men of history and the great battles of history and the political change that happens at the level of political history. And then they had a third category that was called the conjoncture, that is moments at history where change takes place that propel history in different directions. So that's one dimension. What I saw Professor Snyder doing was practicing more along the lines of what Michel Foucault called writing the history of the present. And that is, he's looking at three temporalities, and the temporalities are very interesting because they're very recent historical temporalities. But I'd like to add to that, when we had the really great fortune of having Professor Snyder come to our class, and the class that I'm currently teaching or just finished teaching today on the Nazi occupation of France. And when I opened the discussion with him, where he engaged just beautifully with the students we were dealing with the implementation of the French contributions to the implementation of the final solution. And then he carried us over to what happened in Eastern Europe once the trains left France. But I started the session with him by talking about something that struck me whenever I do this work on the Nazi occupation of France and on the Third Republic and what led up to the Nazi occupation, the fascism and the Second World War. When I'm always struck by, in whatever course I teach, is students come in with very little knowledge about this period of history, almost none. And on the first day of class, for example, I asked them, so what do we know about the Second World War? And they say, well, in high school, we learned sort of at the end of the chapter that, there was D-Day and then the Holocaust. And but no deep knowledge of what were the conditions of possibility that contributed to that. And by the same token, I was teaching another freshman seminar this semester in which I introduced, it's on Paris in the cinema, and I always do a section on Paris under Nazi occupation. And these were freshmen coming in, so it was fascinating to watch their reaction to it. And I was showing them documentary footage of Paris, of what it was like, the conditions of what happened in the city, Hitler marching down the Champs-Élysées, et cetera. And they were fascinated because they said, why did we never learn this before? This is exciting. We want to learn more about this. So what I asked Professor Snyder is, why is there actually so little detailed knowledge about this period of history, which is becoming, for people who work on this period, who see these parallels, he called them patterns with the past that have been so alarming, but that a lot of people don't seem to see. And here it's important because we're dealing with a world-class institution that I like to think we are, and we're getting students who are coming through in their third and fourth year who have very little knowledge about this. So I think what this writing of present, when he's talking about the need to project yourself into the future, to be able to understand the patterns of the past, I think we're looking at a deficit of knowledge about this history in order to be able to recognize those patterns that are before us. And these are amongst educated people. Imagine the populace that's not educated and how they would not be equipped to really see the signs that are before this. So he introduces the three temporalities that Russ has outlined here. And the first one, it's this time of the politics of inevitability. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that because he basically says there's no freedom without a future that one can participate in informing. Untitled. And here he's talking about the moment of rupture created by the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the former Eastern Bloc regimes formed in the aftermath of World War II. Now, he's essentially summarizing Francis Fukuyama's 1990 thesis in his 1991 book, The End of History. And I'm just going to quote Fukuyama here in what he wrote about this. And he's basically saying that the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union represented not just, and I'm quoting here, the passing of a particular period of post-war history, not just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. So that's the politics of inevitability that Professor Snyder is talking about. And he said it can't give us freedom because in order to have freedom, you have to have the capacity to act and have agency in the world. And you just can't have this, the Western liberal democracies and the kind of capitalism that accompanies it, granting us our freedom and also giving us just one future. The future is this. Don't worry about it. We will technically provide it to you. And that's the way the future is going to be. It's the politics of inevitability. So what I found so fascinating about this is he says that this is a period of a pre-authoritarian state, because basically you're sitting back and asking, like the waiter at the table, waiting for someone to hand you freedom. So that means that the person that's hands you the freedom defines the freedom and just grants it to you, and you sit there as a passive object. So what I found really interesting about this is that now Snyder I think he's focused on 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But if I had asked him something about that, if I had been able to engage him in a discussion about this or a conversation about it, I would have asked him that there is also a temporality of the kind of capitalism that came on the scene in the 1980s and 1990s, and especially, and he mentioned it goes back as far as Margaret Thatcher. And here is something that Michel Foucault brilliantly and with amazing foresight identified in the lectures that he gave at the Collège de France in 1978, and that is in the birth of, later published as The Birth of Biopolitics, but it was the rise of what we call neoliberalism. And it's that Austrian school of economics that was advanced by German ordo theorists, most notably Friedrich von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. And this was the form of free market, I call fundamentalist free market capitalism, that was advanced beginning with Thatcher and Reagan. That was a radical form of disruption from the Keynesian kinds of economics that had guided us out of the Great Depression and through the prosperity of the post-war period. And this period of this capitalism, Naomi Klein has a really great book about this that she published in the 2000s, mid 2000s, when this was right before the economic crisis in 2000, and it's called the Shock Doctrine, the Rise of Disaster Capitalism. And she points out that this economic doctrine, which was advanced in the US at the Chicago School of Economics by most notably Milton Friedman and then Gary Becker as well, that it was considered a rogue form of radical thought in the 1950s, but that it really did make its advances into the 70s and then was launched with the Reagan Revolution and the Thatcher Revolution. So one of the things that I would have said to him about this is that you have to remember that in the global north, yes, it was this kind of the free market being given a free rein, deregulation, repealing things like in the 1990s, like the Glass-Steagall Act, which had constrained and separated commercial investment capital from regular banking. That was considered to be the kind of casino capitalism that was thought to have created the Depression in the 1930s. But what happened in the 1970s is that if you were in the global South, and here I'm thinking particularly of Chile in 1973, where a democratically elected regime led by Salvador Allende was subjected to a military coup, that was not pre-authoritarian, that was outright dictatorship. And it was that Chicago School of Economics that was brought in to introduced that form of capitalism that was to shock the economy out of the sort of notions of the welfare state that Allende was advancing and into right into straight up dictatorship. So I would have asked him a question about, depending on where you are in the world, was that really pre-authoritarian? Because it signaled that that there was something about this particular form of capitalism being advanced by the German the liberals through the Chicago School of Economics primarily, that carried within it very serious threats to democracy. So I would just like to point to a really important citation from Foucault's lectures in 1978 that I think bears on what this notion of freedom that Professor Snyder is envisioning. And he writes, this is what they thought. He said, social policy cannot have equality as its objective. On the contrary, it must let inequality function. And I no longer who said it. I think it was Wilhelm Röpke, who was also one of the German ordo liberals. And he said that people complain of inequality, but what does that mean? Inequality, he said, is the same for all. This formula can seem enigmatic, but it can be understood when we consider that for ordo liberals, the economic game, along with the unequal effects it entails, is a kind of general regulator of society that clearly everyone has to accept. So I recently commented this on a piece that I wrote, and here's what I said. I said, the ordo and neoliberal notion that social inequality is a necessity that, quote, everyone has to accept, carries with it an implicit repudiation of the basic democratic principle that the governed should have some say in forming their conditions of existence. So I think what's interesting is to see that the kind of freedom that Professor Snyder talks about at the end of his talks, when he talks about reintroducing child education and investing intensively in early childhood in order to invest in the future, I went back and I found, and I show this to my students in class, this amazing statement that Roosevelt made in 1941 when he called for a Bill of Rights. And that speech now is called the Four Freedoms speech. And I have it. It's a 2-minute speech here. If you want to see it, it's extraordinary, where he set out that basically in order to have freedom, you need to be able to project yourself into the future. And those 4 freedoms were the right to earn a living, for farmers to be able to be paid fairly for their products. And at that time, 40% of the population was on farms. And then also for healthcare. And then finally, the preparation for the social security system. So this language that he's talking about the freedom, the way in which our freedoms depend on what we can project in the future, that's there. And somehow this speech, when I show it to students today, they go, what happened? We're not anything like that anymore. And I think what's intervened is the advance of neoliberal economic doctrines that have become the dominant doxa. So that's about the politics of inevitability. I can say this about the politics of eternity, that it's straight out authoritarianism. We know that. There is no freedom because there is tomorrow. And basically what these leaders are saying is, never mind, don't worry yourselves. We're in charge. We'll let you know what we have in mind for your tomorrow. And I'll let the specialists around the world who are talking about what that looks like on the ground today across the world talk about that. I want to say one final thing about what he says, that the politics of eternity lead into the politics of catastrophe. And that was the part of the talk that really sort of was hair-raising to me. And that is what he's saying is that what we need is that the politics of catastrophe are here in the sense that the future is disastrous, and then you have the 2 options. And he gave the option of the global warming issue, where people on the left will describe it, say we need to intervene on this, but it's this other side of the identitary politics that are coming in that are saying that he's saying we need to recognize the patterns of the past, because what we're seeing is people now dividing along racial lines. And here he's going back to this, to what his argument is in Black Earth. And he kept referring to that to what I had said in my introduction. And I just want to remind people about what he's saying there. He's issuing a stark warning to the contemporary world in demonstrating that the murderous energies the Nazi regime unleashed on Europe during World War II were not an aberration, but rather an indicator of the frightful possibilities available to human societies that are haunted by the specter of dwindling resources and gripped by the terror of existential demise. He thinks we're there. He is echoing Mark Twain, who says history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And he's asking us to see these patterns and to recognize recognize our susceptibility to them, and to be able to intervene with the knowledge of history to be able to sidestep those disastrous possibilities, even though he's not predicting at all what we could do. It's just that because we can't predict the future, there are all these possibilities available to us, but that nonetheless, we have to intervene. And what worries me so much is that there's so little knowledge about what those patterns of history are so that people can recognize in the present. And I just want to say one more thing. And that is, at the end of the talk, someone asked him if everything he was saying here hadn't been said in Hannah Arendt. And I kept thinking to myself, yeah, it's not just Hannah Arendt, it's Jean-Paul Sartre and the French existentialists, because the French existentialists believe that you have to act, that we must define our own values. We don't get a rule book for defining them. And it's with that system of values that we need to make our choices, our authentic choices in the present in order to be able to what they call project, to throw yourself into the future. And so the French existentialists are pretty bleak. They consider freedom to be a heavy burden that you bear, and often involves standing up against a norm and a consensus where you're going to be standing on your own. What I absolutely love about Professor Snyder's take on this is that it is optimistic. When he said, we can have a great society if we intervene, my heart leapt. I was like, yes, we can do this. We have the means to do this. And I was thinking when he said that about, I had just done in my class, the Allied invasion of Normandy. And we watched those 16, 18 to 25-year-old young people going up on those beaches. And it was, if you stand back and look at that operation, you go, wow, we did that. I can't believe we had the ability to do that. He mentioned the space program, but we do have this capacity. And different from the existentialist, he thinks that there is hope, and I just love his hopeful possibility. Russ, I'm going to pass this on, but I want to say one more thing. When everybody's done speaking, I'd like to come back to talk about contemporary France and what's happening in France right now. Today, things are very worrisome. And he mentioned in his talk what he calls this replacement theory. We all heard that version of the articulation of it at the Charlottesville rally that shocked many of us with the tiki torch bearing white supremacists when they were crying out, "You will not replace us." Well, the origination of that notion of replacement is coming from France, from a writer whose name is Renaud Camus, and I can talk about that and the very worrisome developments on the far right now that are in anticipation of the presidential election in coming up next year. So thank you so much for that, and I hope it added something.
All right. Thank you, Rosemary. Your remarks are very much appreciated. So let me start with our first question to the panelists, and that is, I'm going to ask you to define or to give your definition of authoritarianism, and then share your thoughts on Professor Snyder's problematization of the notion of freedom, as this was a central focus of his talk. I'll start with Professor Kubal and then move to Professor Tolbert.
Thank you very much, Russ. Thank you very much for having me here. In terms of defining authoritarianism, I don't think so I'll be very original, but I would like to say it's a form of depluralization of public life, both socially and politically. And what I mean by this is I work on Central Eastern Europe and Russia. And what we have seen, for instance, since Putin came to power in the area of social life was the introduction of what we know now be the foreign agents law, which means that any NGOs that receive funding from abroad have to declare that funding, have to declare themselves as being the foreign agents. They are put on a register that goes, that's followed by quite expensive audits, etc., etc. And that seriously undermined the democratic opposition in Russia. But there's a very similar law in place now in Hungary. In terms of political depluralization, I would say, based on what we are seeing in Hungary particularly, and in Poland, that would be changing the rules of the game as we are playing the game, so that any new election is not the same level playing field. The rules are that much changed to make for the opposition or for the democratic opposition to gain field in that game, because the rules have been changed as the game the game has been played. In terms of my comments on Snyder and his ideas of freedom, I very much relate to what he said at the beginning of the lecture. Being a human rights scholar myself, is that freedom is a value, and I really like to hear his normative approach that it's about imagining freedom, is about imagining the world as it should be. And as a human rights scholar, I would take it a little bit further, and I would say that imagining the freedom as imagining the future as it should be took its realization or embodiment in the human rights regime that took place in the world after the Second World War, after the atrocities of the Second World War. And here I wanted to relate to basically everything that Rosemary has been saying up to now, that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or in Europe, the European Convention of Human Rights, with a quite strong court being able to enforce that rights, is what is ensuring realization of that future for the generations to come. And I'll be quite interested to hear others' views on that.
Very good. Thank you for that, Professor Kubal. So, Professor Tolbert, your area of expertise is U.S. politics. So I'm wondering how you view Professor Snyder's notion of freedom with respect to what's going on in the U.S. Today.
Yes, and I was going to say, I think that I will just say I'm also, as Bill knows, I'm really an internet scholar. And so I study the digital divide. I study internet communications. And I do have some papers that are cross-national and look at political participation and protesting cross-nationally. But I would just kind of remind this group that, and maybe in light of Professor Snyder's essay, that for internet scholars and people, they would argue that the transformation that our society has experienced in the past 20 years and since the 1990s, but really since 2000, is as fundamental as the invention of the printing press. I mean, it's so massive, and it is so destabilizing, and it is so potentially freeing. And so just like the printing press, which initially led to world wars and then eventually led to a rapid expansion of life expectancy and literacy and educational attainment, we are in some ways so destabilized right now because of this incredible revolution that has just occurred with communication technology. And a very interesting thing that is happening is how different countries in the world are taking away access to prevailing communication, using it as a tool for repression, or allowing it to be used for mobilization, freedom of speech, civil society. And Bill, Dasha was just telling me about her really interesting comparison of internet control and censorship in China versus Russia, and how from the very seeds, China controlled the entire infrastructure of the internet. And there were only 3 nodes that they could control. That was the connection from China to the rest of the world. All of the telecommunication companies were created by the government. The contrast would be in Russia, where there was a relatively free internet. And even when Putin was elected, it was a free internet. And it was not until 2014 when the government started to put black boxes, hard censorship, repression on the internet service providers, and how different prevailing modes of communication look like in China with Sesame Credit, in Russia, in Belarus, in the Ukraine, in the United States, in France and Germany. And I really, the Freedom House's scales, not only of free and fair elections, but of internet access and freedoms and freedom of the press and communication, to me, are some of the most important ways that we can operationalize, see this backsliding. So I also study elections, and Bill, I hope we'll talk about elections. And elections are in the US. One of the great challenges that we're experiencing are the people, the significant percentage of our population, it's between 30 and 40%, given our research, believes that there was fraud in the 2020 election. It's not a small percent, it's a big percent. And so widespread beliefs in something like election fraud, when elections are critical to democratic governments, it is the mechanism by which we accept the winner or the loser, regardless of who people individually prefer. So there are lots of threats. My personal opinion is we should be studying communication in the internet, because I see it as the thing that has destabilized us, creates. And one last thing I'll just say is it's not just governments, it's corporations. So our Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen, a West High graduate right here, standing up to, basically Zuckerberg with 2.8 billion users globally, and exposing that the algorithms that they used, gave 5 points for every post that created anger and hate, and 1 point for every post that created a like, and thus baked into the algorithms was something that created toxicity, anger, hate, polarization, divisiveness. That threat is not our government. That threat was a business that wanted to make money for its shareholders. So the threats to me are multiple, but anyway, but so's the potential. Thank you.
Right. Well, and just maybe one comment. That's kind of the sad irony, right, of the internet, is that when it, was created or came into being, the people thought, well, this is going to promote democracy because everyone will have a voice, and this will be shared across multiple platforms, and we'll have all of this great dialogue. But it's actually the reverse that's happened, at least in some cases.
Although it does lead to democracy. It can do both, I think. It's that double-edged sword, right?
Yeah. But I agree that, monitoring communications and studying communications is going to be essential if we're ever going to really be able to grapple with these problems effectively. So to put sort of a buckle on this particular question, I'll ask Professor Garrido to share his thoughts on Professor Snyder's problematization of freedom and how it affects how it affects your area of specialization. What trends are you seeing?
Sure. Hi, Russ. Happy to be here, and it's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. So there are a couple of prompts, and I'd like first to respond to the one about authoritarianism, and then move on to Snyder's comments, to Snyder's talk, my comments in Snyder's talk. I study the Philippines mainly, but also countries really in a generally we call it the global South. And rather than define authoritarianism, I'd like to point to and perhaps describe a space of politics that exists somewhat between democracy and authoritarianism. And I think that's the space that the Philippines is occupying today under the administration of Rodrigo Duterte. So President Duterte he was democratically elected, and it wasn't by any means a landslide. He won with 39% of the vote, but since then, his levels of popular support have really shot through the roof. At some point, his satisfaction rates were over 75 or 80%. In fact, they've remained more or less above 70% for his entire tenure, it's nearing its close at 6 years. And that's just completely unprecedented. In addition to that, satisfaction with democracy is at an all-time high. And this is clearly puzzling because this is the most anti-democratic president the country has had since the Marcos dictatorship. And yet, oddly, people are liking democracy more and more under this guy than they did under the previous, far more liberal, democratically elected presidents. And so that's a real question here. And so it really bears looking into what people are looking for in democracy and how people are thinking about democracy under Duterte. Now, if you don't know, let me just fill in some of the some of the gaps with regard to who this guy is. You might have heard that he was behind this war on drugs, which resulted in a number of extrajudicial killings, particularly among the poor. Some pundits put the number of casualties associated with this war at close to 20,000 people, which is it's really incredible. And again, to take a look at the data, just to give you a sense of how what's happening here is so interesting and in some ways puzzling, and in some ways challenges the comfortable binaries of democracy and authoritarianism and what people want and our expectations that people automatically prefer democracy. So with respect to this war, if you look at the polls, people by and large are scared. They're wary of the police. They're afraid for themselves. At the same time, those kind of results sit quite comfortably alongside results that show people to generally find his extrajudicial campaign to be effective and to largely approve of it. And they find him to be generally effective as a president, and yet they express wariness, fear, mistrust of the police and of the war, and disapproval of these kinds of methods. So again, here's another case in which these two kind of findings sit side by side. So what's happening here? What exactly? How do we explain this strange kind of embrace of Duterte and yet distaste for these methods? I think it's really impossible to understand what's happening in the Philippines without putting this moment in the context of 30 years of their experience of democracy. So the country democratized in the 80s, as did a number of countries as part of this third wave of democratization that swept across the global south and elsewhere. And, this is no longer a new democracy. This is a democracy that has a few decades of experience of what it means to be democratic under its belt. And for the most part, it's been a frustrating experience. It's been one that's punctuated with disappointment after disappointment. It's one in which the euphoria of the 80s has really soured and has given way to a kind of disenchantment. It's been punctuated by reform effort after reform effort to realize a democracy that looked more like the West, a kind of liberal democracy in the US's image. And I think what we're seeing now is a kind of turning point. And so this is why I appreciated Snyder's, as I read it, insistence that we think about what's happening. We situate it in time, and we think about how people think of themselves in the future. What I think is happening here is that folks are, on one hand, reckoning with their democratic experience, and also at the same time trying to think about the future of democracy and what it holds for them. And my sense on the ground is it's not necessarily, and this can be tricky because people often assume that Duterte represents a kind of authoritarianism, or at least a quasi-authoritarianism, or the beginning of a more authoritarian regime. But I don't think that's the case. I think it's actually much more complicated than that. I think in general, people like elections as a mechanism of consultation, but they have a distaste for the politics that comes with it. And so what I often hear on the ground when I do my research is people looking for something in between. In their words, they call it a kind of disciplined democracy. They want elections. They want this mechanism of consultation, but they want order. They want some imposition of social order. And the only way they can imagine it happening is from above. They've looked to institutions before. They looked to the courts. They've looked to Congress. And repeatedly, they've been disappointed. And so now the leader becomes a source of hope. But again, the leader they have in mind, the strong leader, as they put it, is somebody who imposes order from above, sometimes in ways that are ruthless, sometimes in ways that are unsavory and that not everybody likes. But the only way to understand this taste for these illiberal kind of methods is to put it once again in the context of an experience of democracy that has been characterized by frustration. And so, to put a point in it, what I'm suggesting is it's not so clearly a picture of a slide into authoritarianism that we're seeing in a country like the Philippines, and I believe also elsewhere. Rather, we're seeing people reimagining what it means to be democratic. Now, that word I would put in quotations because I will admit that this vision is distinctly illiberal. But I think we need to understand that this is the new imagination, that this is the new prospect. For a long time, this imagination of a liberal democracy did occupy how people imagined themselves, how they projected themselves into the future, as Snyder put it. But it's changed. I think that conversation has changed. And the only way to understand how it's changed is to put it in the context of a long conversation, punctuated, as I said, by disappointments. And so as they think about the future, yes, as Snyder mentioned, they're also wrestling with the past, and they resurrect in their minds figures like Marcos, and they say, well, his reign was brutal, but he was effective. He built roads, he built highways, and I'd like to see that. And they also, conjure figures, specters of folks like Cory Aquino, the first democratically elected president. And they said she was benevolent, she was kind, but she was also ineffective in governing. Her administration led to an increase of disorder, whether crime or political disorder, or growth in informal settlement or poverty, or these kinds of things. And so there's a kind of wrestling with these specters. These figures are brought up again and again to think about what's next, to think about the future. And so, again, I appreciate thinking about this issue, situating it in a longer conversation where people bring in the past. They point to these, I'm calling them specters, to think about what's next. And what we're seeing, I'm suggesting, is a reworking of how to imagine democracy. Now, to be clear, this is not necessarily a democracy that we in the West would value, that we in the West would point to and uphold as a model. But at the same time, it's also not so clearly a case of lapsing from one model of democracy into authoritarianism. This is a gray area. In some ways, it's a kind of a working out of a future that's happening, again, in dialogue with the past, but it's really not clear where it's going yet. There are signs that are worrisome, absolutely. But I might suggest, perhaps a little provocatively, that in some ways it's an exercise of freedom. It's a kind of working out of politics in which these models, which once seemed, you couldn't think outside of them, as Snyder said, there was a sense in which there was only one way to be in the 80s, in the 90s, and it had to look like the United States. That's no longer the case. And that's both terrifying, but at the same time, it's a bit of a relief. In some ways, you have a kind of growing middle class that's working out its political future. And they're looking not just to the United States, but they're looking to China and to other places. And again, I would sound the worrisome note, but also urge folks to kind of see this beyond just two terms, democracy or authoritarianism. There's something else that's happening here that is taking place.
Right. And so I think that's an excellent point. And so I'll pose the next question both to Bill and to Manuel, is that how do you see this gray area that Marco talks about? That is to say, where you've got elections and authoritarianism and order all kind of coming together as a political expression of more than just, say, one party or one person, that there's a certain collective element to this. How does that work, or does it work, or is it working in Russia and Eastern Europe, and then in Latin America?
So I guess I'll tackle Russia and Eastern Europe. Since the turn of the century, since in the late 90s, 2000s, the scholarly, the democratization and democracy scholars started really focusing in on that middle ground. So focusing on what are called hybrid regimes, and coming up with terms like competitive authoritarianism or electoral authoritarianism, and ideas that there are mixed regimes that combine some democratic elements and some authoritarian elements. And one of the things I wanted to point out about authoritarianism is, besides being in some ways meant to be that category of different regime types that is the opposite of democracy, it can also be seen as a scale. There are degrees of democraticness, but also autocraticness, I guess. And so regimes can exist in different places along the scale. And so North Korea and Cuba are both governed by regimes that we would usually call authoritarian, but the degree to which that they treat their people harshly, that they are depluralized, as Professor Kubal said earlier, they vary tremendously. And countries likewise can change over time in terms of the extent to which their regime is autocratic. And one of the trends that's going on in the post-communist world broadly is that the countries where democracy seemed to take roots in the 1990s are experiencing a decline in the quality of their democracy, an increased autocraticness in the way that they're being governed. So they're actually declining as democracies. The places that stayed autocratic throughout the 90s didn't really democratize much at all. There's some of the places in Central Asia and the Caucasus and Eastern Europe where we've seen some progress over the last 10 years or so. And so the trends can go in different directions. And in part, it's because the degree to which repression, control of the media, control of people's organizational activities by the regime, that can change over time. Russia started out in the 90s as more democratic, or at least more competitive politically than other post-Soviet countries. And then under Putin, it has just kind of gone on a steady slide downward and become more and more autocratic, particularly over the last 10 years, even the last 5 years, in a way that is not true in other post-Soviet countries. So, there's a number of different dynamics going on in that regard.
Very good. Thank you. And Manuel, same question.
Thank you, and thanks for organizing this. This is a great discussion, and I'm really glad to be a part of it. So, I had prepared a number of different notes to your questions, and I kind of want to throw everything out and, just to deal with the stuff that different people have said, because it's super interesting. And I want to pick on one thread in particular, which is this about expectations of democracy, right? The point that Marco made. And I think that's a key point, right? And so, go back to the 80s, go back to Latin America, and the first democratic precedent after the dictatorship of the 70s in Argentina in 1983 takes over power, right? He's democratically elected. He sits in front of Congress, and in his first speech, he says one of the first paragraph of his speech ends saying, with democracy, we don't only vote, but we also eat, educate, and cure. Right? So he is setting himself up for really high expectations for what democracy provides to people, right? Fast forward to now and extend this around the region, and I would argue around sort of global south, as Marco was saying, and some of those expectations were really, really, really high and haven't been met. So in some sense, I think the level of dissatisfaction and the level of rethinking about what democracy means, and a lot of the authoritarian tendencies that we've seen emerge out of sort of unmet expectations, right, of what democracy would bring once we transition to democracy, right? And so I think we need to understand sort of democratic threats or authoritarian threats to democracy nowadays in this light, right? And so if we look at Latin America, right, about 10 years ago, Kurt Weiland wrote, and said the main threat to democracy right now in Latin America is the populist left. And it's the populist left because of its ability, capacity, and willingness to concentrate power, right? And so it is those actors that, were claiming to serve the people that now are the ones that are threatening the system by trying to sort of concentrate that power, right? And so, again, we look at that threat. That was really controversial when Weiland said it, because historically the threat to democracy in Latin America came from the right, not the left, right? And so, and we start looking at it, and that threat materialized in some cases. Venezuela, Chavez, Maduro's clearly turned authoritarian, but not in others, right? And that threat has sort of shifted and emerged and sort of shifted to the right as well as the left through time. And again, it has to do a lot with the expectations and the unmet expectations. You have a turn to the left. That turn to the left does not produce sort of those outcomes that people are expecting with democracy. Therefore, some people start to either, cling to their seats and try to concentrate power, or then you get the backlash from the right, again, sort of threatening some components of liberal democracy again, right? And again, I'm using the air quotations that Marco was talking about because, again, these are loaded terms, right? These are really complex terms. And so in a nutshell, what we see in Latin America is a set of different threats to democracy, a set of different sort of authoritarian trends that come from different places. And some of them also deal with sort of corporations, and some of them deal also with external powers. Right? It's not only about what happens locally, even though that is the most important part, but there's sort of a geopolitical component here that is not irrelevant at all. So the picture is really complex. It's really sort of context specific in different countries, but we see democracy under threat from different paths. And I think that the common thread to those have to do with a certain high expectations that were unmet by 20, 30 years of democratization.
Very good. And then, in terms of those threats, I think part of it also deals with looking at, certain segments of the population that are probably more oppressed than others. And so I'm wondering, if we could talk a little bit about what's going on with respect to repression concerning gender, sexuality, women's rights. Let's say in Poland and the Soviet Union. Maybe Marina, you would like to tackle that question, and then we can open that up to the panel at large.
Thank you. Well, I'm not an expert on gender and reproductive rights. However, I think that the region that I study, which is Eastern Europe and specifically Russia, is a place from which we can derive a lot of lessons about how reproductive rights or debates about reproductive rights can be mobilized for political purposes. So President Putin's rule has been very much characterized by his seizing on traditional or neo-traditional ideas of family and sexuality, to the extent that sort of the idea of free choice and plurality, as Agnieszka said, in the area of reproduction, sexuality, and family formation has really become politicized and become equated with the external enemy. And here I'm referring to what Manuel was just talking about, it's the enemy from the outside that, in Russia's case, it's the United States and the Western Europe and NATO that really has helped Putin concentrate power in his own hands. Right? It's not necessarily what these external actors do. It's more that they provide fodder for the political leadership to use to mobilize people in support of the populist, authoritarian hybrid or competitive authoritarian regime, however you want to, for instance, characterize Russia. But the interesting thing is that the ideas about gender and sexuality and reproduction and family is something that everybody can has an opinion about. Everybody can think about. They're relatable, right? There's something that is very easy to weaponize for political purposes. So in the region that I work on, really we see this very clear tendency to create a myth of traditional values, right? And I'm doing air quotes because they've never really been traditional or prevalent or, never existed in this conglomeration that they exist now, right? Creating this myth that these values have been around and are genuinely Russian, and they distinguish us, the Russians, from them, the liberal capitalist democracies out there, who are the enemy, right? So now the sort of political disagreements about development and economic disagreements and policy disagreements all get reframed in terms of the social values in a way that a person who doesn't follow politics can still relate to, right? So that's how they get an ordinary average person who might not be abreast of political development to go and vote and support President Putin because they're scared of homosexuality, they're scared of feminism. They don't really understand what feminism actually means, nor do they understand sort of what the movement of feminism is like in the West. But these are things that are presented to them as threatening, as corrupting, as polluting, as sort of destroying the traditional way of life. And they serve as this very easy mobilization mechanisms. And we see this throughout authoritarian regimes where, gender issues become extremely weaponized. I mean, we can think about Theodor Adorno's writing about how patriarchy and authoritarianism have a lot in common, right? And if you look at it, of course they do, right? You have a strong, usually male figure reliant on force and protection and security and provision. So there's very traditional ideas of masculinity. Defending the people, right? So this is very similar to the patriarchal ideas, as well as sort of ideas that people believe represent the traditional ways of being in society, which, of course, talking about the role of history, going back to Snyder's lecture, if we actually look at history and if actually call historical temporality present, in very few places have they ever really existed as such in the form that they're presented now. Have they ever been real traditional or characteristic of any society? But I think Dr. Kubal is better prepared to address this question than me.
Thank you so much, Marina. I think I completely agree with everything you said, and if I could add a little bit, is sort of to go back to the ideas, my initial comments on Timothy Snyder's lecture with regard to the ideas of freedom, and that freedom is restricted because we change the rules of the game while we play the game, and also that sort of the idea that by this I mean democracies and Central and Eastern Europe or Russia are no longer bound by the rules that we signed up to somewhere in the democratization process, particularly those resulting from human rights obligations. So with respect, what repercussions does this have in relation to women human rights or reproductive rights in Poland is very clear. I mean, the same week that there was the hearing in front of the US Supreme Court around Roe versus Wade, the potential reappeal of that important case law that traced the reproductive rights in the American Constitution. The very same day, in Poland, in Polish parliament, we debated a law that would completely criminalize any form of abortion, even if that abortion was therapeutic, even in case of that pregnancy was a result of rape, of incest, and punishing the woman with up to 12 years in prison for having that abortion. That is, if she didn't die in the process of it, obviously. And that, I must say, is not only difficult to comprehend just on a common sense ground, because, for instance, for rape, according to the legal system now in Poland, one can be charged with 6-8 years in prison, while for abortion of a pregnancy that would result from that rape, the woman would spend in prison, it would be equal to homicide, and the woman would spend in prison 12 years. So the proportion here is completely lost. But I think that's a symptom of in my research, I speak with human rights lawyers from Poland and Central Eastern Europe who bring the cases against those countries, against violations like the ones we are seeing, the proposals or the bills being debated in the parliament, to the international court. And what is happening actually under current governments is that releasing of that relationship, of that oversight of the international court, like the European Court of Human Rights, lets things like this happen, and really stifles any challenges of that horrific new laws and new rules of the game that are being established. So again, just to reiterate how important the international oversight of the human rights regime is in the region, I think the recent years only have shown Arabur.
Very, very good. Thank you, Agnieszka. And I know that, Rosemary, you have a question for Bill, but before you pose that, I would just like to remind everyone to please submit your questions for the panel via the Q&A. So Rosemary, please go ahead.
Yeah, just getting back to Western Europe, one of the things that Professor Snyder said was that because of there is no future under the politics of eternity, that nothing is going to change in these societies as they become more authoritarian. And so someone like Mr. Putin is meddling with liberal democracies that have had actually long traditions of civil rights and the constitutional rights in order to be able to undermine them. And I think it's important here that in 2017, Marine Le Pen got both a digital assist and a financial assist. Marine Le Pen was, until Eric Zemmour showed up on the scene, the far right of the position. He actually financed her campaign, and then he tried to do a document dump, just like happened here in the 2016 election, right before the election. But French law, if memory serves me correctly, shuts down that sort of thing 24 hours before an election, so it couldn't work. So could you talk about his interest in undermining Western European democracies? And I think after you say that, I'd like to follow up on what also Marco said, is that this thing about the democracy failing the present, it's happening in France as well, where social democracy is in retreat as well. So could you answer that, and then we can maybe follow up on what's happening in Western Europe a little bit?
Sure. Well, Putin is very much interested in reducing the effectiveness of democracy in Western Europe and the United States, in part because they're geopolitical rivals, but in part because really Russians in many ways identify with Western Europe, where they see themselves as Europeans, partially at least. And so to the extent that democracy functions well in this part of the world that Russians look to, it does raise the question of, why can't we have democracy too? How long is Putin going to be in charge? And it does call into question some of the paternalism, really, that underlies the regime. And so, he has reasons to worry about democracy just as a rival picture of the future, I guess, for Russians, particularly, and of course, most demonstrably, when democracy movements happen in the countries that border Russia, the former Soviet Union, the near abroad. And he has used every sort of foreign policy tool that he thinks he can get away with to try to cause those kinds of problems. So digital hacking and information dumps, the funding, and a whole variety of other things that are designed to cause problems for democracies.
Very good. Thanks for that, Bill. And Manuel, I know that you have a question for Marina, a point that you wanted to follow up on.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask sort of the question about to what extent do you think that these issues about gender and about reproductive rights aren't used as wedge issues, right? And this relates a little bit to the point that Snyder made in his lecture about freedom as something that is collective, right? It's not an individual freedom, but it's collective freedom to look sort of into the future, and that requires us to sort of be connected with other people. And to what extent isn't that one issue on which Putin, as well as other leaders, may seek to sort of break that collective, to sort of polarize, to create the us and them kind of dynamic that ends up sort of destroying that type of freedom that Snyder was talking about, right? And in that line, to what extent do you think this is what other issues are used in that way? Or are there issues that he really cares about, or are they simply sort of tools to sort of break that possibility of collective?
Yeah, thank you. You're absolutely right. Wedge issue is the right way to put it, and because wedge is something that puts the division between the groups, right? So it's divide and conquer kind of thing, right? So it is very important for people like Putin to emphasize, to create this artificial identity that people within the country can relate to, and that would also separate them from others, right? It's also very important to imbue these issues with a lot of emotional resonance, so that they are scary and they're mobilizing people, right? We see this so much with issues of sexuality and reproductive rights. So that Europe, which is in Russian is Europa, in Putin's speak oftentimes goes by gay Europa, right? Like, so gay Europe, right? So it's equating all of these things that are, in this perverse imaginary are somehow deviant from the good wholesome Russian soul, right? Is distinguishing it from Europe. And of course, you're absolutely right about connecting it to Snyder's ideas about freedom. I think so, kind of to bring it all together, I would say that freedom is about imagining, an ability to imagine and make happen the future based on your values, right? So there's nothing more connected to future than the issues related to women and children, right? In a lot of ways. So this fits really beautifully on a very simple kind of intuitive level to the idea of continuity, right? It's how do we want to proceed? Do we want to become this rotten, perverse, or whatever other, unflattering characteristics Putin and other populist autocratic leaders assigned to Europe, to America, to ideas of democracy? Do we want to go into that chaotic, unstable, unclear future, or do we want to stick to our imagined past, the politics of eternity, right? Do we want to stick to this thing that never really existed, but then we don't really have to question things, we don't have to imagine things, we don't have to decide for ourselves. There is this very clear road that we need to follow, and this road is black and white. It's already spelled out for you, and who better to protect our way to that eternity but the populist leader. And very quickly, there are other issues that populists, authoritarian populists sort of use. And this is just not just Putin, right? Like we can think about Duterte, we can think about we can think about Orban, we can think about Erdogan, we can think about Trump. It's a lot of the sort of issues that harken to traditional way of life. So religion, lots of religious beliefs get really weaponized. Based on living in America, it's the idea of liberty and individual freedoms, which is quite interestingly, as Snyder pointed out, freedom should not be a conservative far-right issue. Freedom should be about getting people to where they can pursue different avenues of life, right? Through, for instance, social welfare support and so on and so forth. But it's become a wedge thing where, are you for freedom or are you for rights? Well, these things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And for Putin specifically, one very clear issue that's become a big wedge issue is the interpretation of history in regards to the Second World War. So this memory of how the West really stood back and watched millions of Russians die as we defeated fascism. And then West swooped in and said that they won the war and relegated Russia to second-class citizens on the international arena. Right? This is the narrative that kids are taught at school. This is the narrative that everybody believes. And it is, if you think about it, what a great injustice, indeed, if you compare the numbers of Russians that died during the Second World War, Soviet people, versus the numbers of, Americans, it's fascinating when my undergraduate students tell me that America won again Nazism, it's not exactly factually true either, but the weaponizing that history, going back to that history really connects to this very specific vision of future that also precludes any kind of freedom. So thank you, Manuel.
Very good. And I know that, Marco, you wanted to add a point to this, and I'm sorry for glossing over you earlier, because I know that Rosemary had a question for you embedded in her comments. But please go ahead, Marco.
Great. It'll be a quick question. This has been an excellent conversation. I just wanted to point out that, at issue is not just the recovery of so-called traditional values, but also the emergence of new groups who seek to articulate what they would call, quote unquote, modern values. And that again is a future orientation. And so in the case of the Philippines, but again, also elsewhere, Latin America, South Asia, you're really seeing the emergence of a politically empowered middle class for the first time, not just as an economic group, but as a social and as a political group. And their desire is to modernize, they articulate certain kinds of modern values, sometimes against other groups within the country, for instance, the urban poor. And so one part of what democratization did in the Philippines, in the democratic constitution, was that it institutionalized certain rights for informal settlers and for the urban poor in general. And there's been a backlash against that kind of empowerment. There's a sense in which the enfranchisement of groups like the urban poor, who in the minds of many of the middle class, though they have the vote, really don't know enough to take part in the vote. It has become a real issue and a push against democratization. And this is interesting because traditionally the literature has linked democratization with the middle class, and indeed democratization in the 80s was really, there's a middle class contingent at the forefront. But now, if you look at poll support for somebody like Duterte, it's the groups with the most education, college education and above. It's those with the most wealth that are his most enthusiastic supporters. I would say even the opinion leaders. And that, again, is very telling, fascinating, interesting, and worth unpacking. So once again, I think it's right that there's a move to recover traditional values, but there's also, again, a forward-looking, future-looking. We're in power now, and we need to remake this country in a way that it's never been in the past before. And that might mean silencing some groups who democracy has empowered. So that's a dynamic that I want to make sure is part of the conversation.
Very good. And Rosemary, I know that sort of following up on that, you had wanted to respond to Marina's comments, and I think they align with Marco's as well, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in the Nazi occupation class, I take I save the space for this amazing documentary film that was done in 2007 called Stalingrad, in which you have, I don't know if you know that, Marina, that film, but the students, it's really stunning to watch because they interview both the German soldiers who were trapped at Stalingrad, and they watch Hitler just sociopathically say, let's just let the Sixth Army of 300,000 people die, as Zhukov's the pincer movement is surrounding him. And it was really an important thing, I think, for students to see, because when you're working on Western Europe, you say Stalingrad was the turning point of the war that changed the dynamics where everybody now knows the war is turning, but we don't actually do Stalingrad. And the students came away from all the films that I showed, all of which were harrowing, with that film having been the most powerful. So I think it's important, incumbent on us who work on this part of the world to look back and say, this was a two-front war, and the Soviets did play a role, and Stalingrad, I mean, 600,000 people, I think, total died at Stalingrad. I think that's an important history, and that could be a point of commonality. I just wanted to say also one thing to Marco, and that is in France right now, there was a massive protest called the Gilets Jaunes movement a couple of years ago, in which the far right was claiming it's on est chez nous, this is our land, therefore instantiating these racial divisions that Snyder was talking about. But what's so striking about what you're saying, Marco, is that if you look at the parts of France that came down to protest, these were areas that neoliberal globalization has left behind, and they are looking for a solution because they think now that the liberal democracy is not meeting their needs. And that's very frightening, because if you take the electoral map in France and you put it what used to be the really strong social democratic strongholds of the northern regions, of the industrial regions and the mining regions of the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, but now they're all National Front. They've all receded. The social democratic left is leading. Right now, the socialist candidate, Anne Hidalgo, who is the social democratic representative, she's polling at 4% of the vote, whereas Eric Zemmour and Marine Le Pen are at 30%. That's getting a little close to the numbers that Hitler had in that last election before he was appointed. And so I'm wondering if there's not this move happening right now where within the Western liberal democracies, they're seeing that the needs are not being met and they're looking for these authoritarian solutions. And that's kind of frightening, given that this is happening in what Hitler called le pays des droits de l'homme, the country of the rights of man declared at the revolution. So I thought your point was really interesting.
You know, I just wanted to appreciate, Rosemary, you're pointing to the process of neoliberalism.
Yes.
Comments right now, but also before. And you know, what's interesting is if we put the Philippine case alongside France, it's really the winners of a process of neoliberalization. So just like everywhere else, neoliberalization has resulted in sharp inequalities.
Right. Exactly.
But one thing it's done is it's empowered a kind of middle class that has access to travel abroad, to travel across the region, right, own real estate. And they look around and they feel trapped by democracy, by the fact that they're people who they consider under them have equal say at the vote. And that's an interesting dynamic. It recalls, 18th, 19th century kind of revulsion towards the masses. There's a sense in which how come politically we have the same rights as them when we have greater education, we have a better say? They end up voting for people that we can't stand, and this election after election. And so, that's led to really ambivalent, conflicted feelings about the vote. And oftentimes on the ground, it's not unusual to hear people say, we need to limit the vote to people with property, people who pay taxes, to so-called shareholders in this nation, people who actually put stuff in, as opposed to the majority, who take land and who don't do anything but still have a say politically. And so there's no question that this too is a creation of the various processes, including the economic ones, but it's playing out in a very particular way. That's just so interesting to put in comparison as we've been doing in this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you, Marco. And so we have about 5 minutes left. Bill has been patiently waiting. He raised his hand and Manuel did as well. So Bill, please go ahead, and then Manuel, and then we'll put a finer point on this at 3:30.
Thanks, Russ. Well, so I wanted to say that the focus on freedom and Snyder's concept of it, and a lot of the conversation today has been sort of from the bottom up, focused on society, societal divisions, and what they mean for democracy and authoritarianism, but also what has bubbled to the surface on several occasions from several of our participants today is the idea that a lot of this is driven by power seeking by elites, both political and economic, and that the elites in the society, their relationship is, interdependent and kind of, like electricity. You can't have one without the other. So, really the tough part of thinking this all through is figuring out what do we do when it is in the interests of elites to create divisions, to build on divisions, and to remove mechanisms like democratic procedures that can allow for those for societal divisions to be worked out in a better way.
Very good. Thank you for that, Bill. And Manuel, please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of jump in on actually something that Bill is mentioning, and that is sort of the power of polarization, right, as a tool, right, which is this creation of us and them. And I think sort of that's a common thread of a number of different comments that we've heard today. And I think the point here is one in which, you know, even places that are somewhat immune, say, to populism, right, they're not immune to polarization as a technique, right? There's many different ways of polarizing. And I want to sort of to use one example from Latin America on this, right? You know, Latin America, lots of populism all around the place, but there's one place where that populism never really took hold. And we've been thinking for decades and years that Chile was not a place where populism could take hold, right? But now, if there's an election coming up, right? There was a presidential election, there's a runoff election in a couple of weeks. And this is the most polarized election that has ever taken place in Chile in forever, where we see an extreme right candidate and a pretty leftist candidate going at it, both with, you know, almost equal number of the vote, right? And so even in contexts where we don't see sort of the populist component, we still see that polarization component. And I think that is sort of the crux that cuts across a number of the cases and the regions, right? Whether we have populism or not, that polarization is in many senses the sort of guiding threat that we see. This definition of us and them, this elites manipulating and saying, you know, it's them, it's this. And it also links back to the inequality questions that Marco and Rosemarie were talking about, right? That inequality is also about sort of distancing and creating these divisions and sort of polarizing the political sphere. And so if you haven't taken a look, please Google Caste. Caste is the extreme right-wing candidate in Chile. And Google Caste and gender, and your heads will blow up. I can assure you, your heads will literally blow up, right? Because it's literally unreal, the stuff that comes out of this person's mouth, right?
No,
and it's really, I just wanted to highlight this. I cannot stop myself. Sorry about that, Russ.
Oh, no. This is, I mean, we're all learning so much. I mean, I had no idea that this was going on in Chile, and I had no idea what this, you know, far right party was about. So right after this webinar concludes, I'm going to Google up Caste is his name, you say?
Yeah, Caste. It's
okay, Caste.
K-A-S-T.
Okay, very good. No, but that I want to learn as much as I can. So we will need to conclude. But before I do, I wanted to let you know that this discussion will continue next semester. That international programs is dedicated to promoting discussions such as these, especially because the situation is so fluid. We have a number of elections coming up within the next few months and next year. And so this is going to be a through line with respect to our webinars as we move into the new year and beyond. And sort of to that point, both Bill and Marina are organizing a conference next spring, and we wanted to make sure that we at least gave them a minute or two to talk about their conference, when it'll take place, what the themes will be about, and what we should look for in anticipation of that conference.
I'll jump in, Bill. Thank you, Russ. So yes, please put the conference on your calendar, because this is going to be another great opportunity to talk about some of the same issues that we've brought up in this discussion, and very much things that relate to the conversation that Dr. Snyder started in his lecture with us. The official name of the conference is Corruption, the Rise of Populism and the Future of Democracy Symposium. It's co-sponsored by a few different units here on campus, but primarily it's sponsored by International Programs and Political Science Department. And it's going to take place on April 1st and 2nd. And it's going to bring together a number of big thinkers from around the world, actually, who think and write about issues related to populism and the rise of sort of the spread of authoritarian governance throughout the world, and discuss sort of the future of democracy. We're going to have some of the people that are here that I cannot wait to host here at Iowa come in person, which is kind of amazing, and it's going to add that much more vigor to the discussion. The subtopic of the conference is corruption, right? So we will discuss different ways in which the experience of corruption contributes to people's feelings about democracy and support for non-democratic ideas. We will talk about how claims of corruption are mobilized by political outsiders to come to power. We will then look at how accusations of corruption are used to discredit and sometimes unseat leaders of opposing political groups. And finally, we're gonna take a look at how anti-corruptionism, or fighting the way the corruption is fought, can be mobilized either to actually fight corruption, or it can be mobilized to strengthen the grip on power by non-democratic leaders. So just to throw a few names out there, in addition to Professor Garrido, Professor Ballan, Professor Talbert, we're going to have Professor Javier Aguero, we're going to have Professor Tom Ginsberg, we're going to have Dr. Kurt Wayland, we're going to have Dr. Monica Prasad, we're going to have Professor John Hagan. So it's going to be big. So please join us for that. Bill?
Well, I can't add a whole lot. I will say that there's a variety of different formats too. Over the course of those 2 days, we'll have public lecture, we'll have roundtable sort of thing. We'll have sessions in which some of these scholars present their cutting edge work that they have just been working on, really up-to-date stuff, with an opportunity for the audience to interact with them and for discussions to ensue on the basis of that. So there are a lot of different ways in which people will be able to interact with our guests and with these ideas.
Well, it sounds exciting, and we're certainly all looking forward to it, if for no other reason that we'll get to see Agnieszka, Marco, and Manuel once more. So please let me thank everyone, each of the panelists. Let me thank Rosemary, the IP staff, and the audience for attending this absolutely fascinating discussion. You can view it online in a couple of weeks' time. If there are further questions, please feel free to contact us. But in the interim, please study the issues that were elicited today, so that we can come prepared for the conference in April. And with that, let me thank you one more time and wish you all a pleasant good afternoon or a pleasant good evening. Thank you.